Sylvia was a very beautiful girl. She worked day and night on the household. Her life was beautiful. She was happy and harmonious. But the day came when she lost everything she held dear. One day she was doing her chores as usual, but suddenly she heard strange noises at the door. When she opened it, she saw a ghost. That day she lost everything: friends, family, and home. She was once a happy wife, and if at the beginning their relationship was going very well, then something went wrong. Her husband left her, and Sylvia had to return to her father. Unfortunately for her, her husband and father had one passion: gambling. They lost fortunes in them. No amount of persuasion worked. One day my father lost everything they had. They could have used the money to pay off their debts because Sylvia had already been attacked. But instead, Dad lost everything. And to save his life, he sacrificed his daughter's life. Her father sold her into slavery like some kind of cattle. When the next buyer of live goods came in, it fell to Sylvia. Her name was Jana. She needed someone who could be in charge of working in the fields, shopping, cooking, chopping wood, gathering herbs. But in fact, Sylvia was grateful to Jana, because if she hadn't chosen her, the girl would have ended up in a brothel. She had a lot of work to do, but it was better than servicing men. 3 years have passed since then. Sylvia had stopped even dreaming of freedom, but she was proud of her work. Even though the master did not allow slaves to be friends, Sylvia was happy in her own way. She spent a lot of time alone and thought that love was just a waste of time. Once again, when she went into the forest to pick mushrooms, she came across a young man who was unconscious. Sylvia did not know who it was. His wounds were pretty deep, and Sylvia realized if nothing was done about it, the guy was going to die. After a while, he opened his eyes. Sylvia was glad he wasn't dead, but the young man was acting a little strange. He pushed her away and yelled "Fry" at the top of his voice. It was a word he repeated repeatedly in different ways, but Sylvia didn't understand what it meant. The young man started coughing fearfully, holding his chest. It was obvious that he was badly wounded. His heart was beating like an abnormal heartbeat. Sylvia realized that she simply could not leave him in such a critical condition, and something had to be done. She thought she could help him as quickly as possible and then go about her other business. Jana probably wouldn't even notice if she was a little late. Sylvia moved closer to the young man, but he pulled out a knife and shouted "Fry" again. Then a look of surprise came over his face. He seemed to come to his senses and started looking around for someone named Finn. Sylvia stood there thinking about how to help him. If she left him like that, the boy would definitely die. But he still had the knife in his hand and should have knocked it out. Sylvia took a few swift steps and intercepted the hand with the knife. Then she tripped him, causing him to fall backwards and drop the knife. Sylvia laid him down on the soft grass and began to examine him. It was worse than she realized. The young man was bleeding. There was no time to think. Sylvia gathered some herbs and made a mixture of them. Then she built a fire and she heated the knife. She realized that the guy was going to be in a lot of pain, but it had to be done to save his life. When he opened his eyes, he thought he was facing a real demon with a knife in his hands. He screamed and immediately passed out from the pain. A sort of field operation was successful. Sylvia put a bandage on the wound. She wanted very much to take the young man she had found home, but the owner would not allow it and punished the girl. And besides, the villagers did not like strangers. She saw something peeking out of the guy's pocket. It was a beautiful locket. It had a dragon in the center and a gemstone in the middle. The locket was very beautiful. Sylvia thought it was worth a real fortune. On the one hand, she wanted to take the locket for herself because it could be a chance for freedom. But Sylvia was not the kind of person who would steal from a helpless person. She had to go, because the job couldn't go Soma, but she couldn't just leave the boy. The young man, though he looked thin, was quite heavy. Sylvia carefully lifted him up and dragged him to safety. She covered him with the cloak. The young man was asleep and could not hear her words. Nevertheless, Sylvia said goodbye to him and asked him to take care of himself. She promised to return soon. Sylvia returned and set to work. She collected eggs, did the laundry, washed the dishes, and all the while she thought about the boy she'd found in the woods. She couldn't tell anyone about him. Even the piece of bread she really wanted to eat herself she set aside for him. As she fell asleep, her only thought was that nothing would happen to him during the night. The young man Sylvia found in the forest slept peacefully all night under a spreading tree. When he woke up, he didn't remember what had happened to him. He didn't even know where he was. His head was just splitting with pain. He didn't understand why he was still alive. Had that soulless landlubber that had found him yesterday saved his life? That same day, Sylvia put the rudimentary food in her basket and went into the forest. She had no trouble finding the place where she had left the boy. Luckily, he was alive and even regained consciousness. When he saw her, he was frightened. But Sylvia seemed very friendly. She said she would not hurt him in any way and smiled. She held out a loaf of flavored bread. But the young man turned away from the food. He was stubborn and stubborn. When Sylvia realized that persuasion didn't work on him, she had to treat him badly. Otherwise, he would starve to death. Sylvia grabbed his wounded arm, so much so that the poor man screamed. That's what I needed. He tasted a piece of bread and liked it. Now the young man began to eat on his own without compulsion. He must have been very hungry indeed. The lad, though full, did not say a word of thanks. Sylvia had to leave because she had work to do, but she promised to come again tomorrow and bring more food. As she was about to leave, the young man uttered something like Naro Lu. Sylvia thought they were words of gratitude. She promised that she would come back again tomorrow. She was walking and thinking. She had got a very strange guy after all, even though he was very handsome. When all the slave girls were already asleep, Sylvia heard some whistling. She looked out the window and kept thinking about that guy. It was very cold outside. She was worried if he was all right. She couldn't sit idly by. She stood up quietly. She went to the wardrobe where the bedroom sets were and picked one up. Django was sleeping peacefully and didn't notice the fugitive. Sylvia went to the boy she had found. She easily found the place where she had left him, but when she saw the young man, she was frightened. He had red eyes and looked very frightening. Sylvia covered him with the sheet she had brought. As she was leaving, he shouted something to her, but she did not understand his speech. Sylvia promised that he'd be back again tomorrow. The young man was actually thinking about why she was doing this and caring about him. It was a new day at work. Sylvia had a lot of responsibilities. Today she had to do the laundry. There were a lot of things to do. One of the slave girls dropped a tray with a teapot. She was immediately punished for the offense. Sylvia found it hard to contain herself. On the one hand, she wanted to stand up for the negligent girl, but on the other hand, she couldn't do anything about it. So Sylvia clenched her teeth and continued washing. Sylvia waited for a convenient moment. She took a basket of sewing supplies and some food and set off into the woods. The young man was sleeping peacefully. Sylvia decided he needed to change his bandages. The guy woke up, but he had a very disgruntled look on his face. Of course, who would like to be yanked back and forth? Sylvia took a piece of bun out of the basket and held it out to the young man. He sat and watched her warily. He could not understand who this girl was and why she cared for him so much. Sylvia started coming to see him every day. Each time she brought him something delicious. She took care of him, changed his bandages. After a while, the lad got strong enough to stand up with Sylvia's help. She dampened a cloth with water and wiped his face. The young man was still speaking, but Sylvia could not understand a word he said. This language was completely unfamiliar to her. Pointing a finger at himself, he said Kale. Sylvia thought that was the name of this handsome young man, and hers was what he called Jara Goulet. She said her name was Sylvia. The young man learnt her name easily. Despite the fact that she did not understand what he was saying, they had a lot of fun together. The main thing was that they learnt each other's names, so now they always addressed each other by their first names. However, this idyll could not last long. Jana noticed that Sylvia was missing and went looking for her. She wandered through the forest, shouting her name. Sylvia had to run away, otherwise if Jana found her, she would be in trouble. Kale could see by the look on Sylvia's face that something unpleasant was happening. He didn't want to let her go. Kale grabbed her arm to hold her back. Strangely enough, he uttered the phrase, "Don't go." Was he really learning so fast that he was starting to memorize words? She couldn't stay near him. Sylvia said goodbye and left. Kale looked at her sadly. Jana managed to find Sylvia. She immediately grabbed her by the hair. But apparently Sylvia was on her good behavior because no special punishment followed. Jana simply said that it must not happen again and took her to the village. Sylvia spent an almost sleepless night. She kept thinking about Kale, how she was doing and if he was all right. She kept remembering how he had addressed her. Lu Vana Lu, Sylvia. What those words meant, she never understood. She was overwhelmed with feelings and for some reason she was afraid. In the morning, she went into the woods again. She was eager to find out more about Kyle. When she arrived at the clearing, she found Kale sleeping peacefully. She didn't want to wake him, so she decided to wait until he woke up and maybe she could talk to him. She contemplated his handsome face. He looked very gentle for a savage. She felt stronger next to him because he trusted her. Apparently, she was feeling very tired. It was no wonder, for she had spent a sleepless night. So she fell asleep in the clearing next to Kale. When Kale woke up, he saw Sylvia dozing beside him. He was glad she had come. While she slept, Kale decided to get some refreshment. He was very hungry. Sylvia slept for quite a long time. When she woke up, she realized with horror that the time was too long. She couldn't be late again. Jana would not forgive her a second time. He didn't want to let her go again, but Sylvia didn't have time to explain. She was late again. He just didn't realize that she couldn't stay late for long. Sylvia ran as fast as she could to get back in time. But when she opened the door, they were already waiting for her. One of the slave girls grabbed Sylvia and shouted to Jana that the girl had returned. She said that the master had decided to punish her because he suspected her of running away. Alas, Jana could not help her, as she was also a servant. Sylvia was beaten with a rod and sent to the cellar and put on a chain. While Sylvia was away, Kale was able to take care of himself. He made firewood, built a fire. Sylvia was gone for 2 whole days. She'd never been gone that long. Thanks to Sylvia's efforts, he regained his strength and was able to survive. He was able to get his own food and take care of his own safety. Yes, he was worried about her, but he couldn't just sit around and wait. Besides, he had to find his way home. But he couldn't find his way home on his own. He needed Finna's help, who had to be found first. He made many attempts to find her. He climbed trees, climbed rocks, looked in gorges, but she was nowhere to be found. Exploring the surrounding area, he found the remains of some kind of camp. He did not know what had happened here. On the ground, he noticed strange, large footprints. They were clearly not those of a man, but of some huge beast. Suddenly, he remembered what had happened. He was flying a dragon, and he was trying to evade the chase. As he stood pondering, a shadow hovered over him. Looking up, he saw a dragon above him. It was the very Finna he had been looking for. Kale threw his arms around him. Draco rumbled contentedly like a cat. Now that Finna had been found, it was safe to go home. Meanwhile, Sylvia was reminiscing. She thought back to the time when she had first fallen in love. She reminisced about her ex-husband, who eventually kicked her out because he no longer needed her. She remembered the perpetual shouting and the way they blamed each other. She remembered that incredible feeling when she was expecting a child. She remembered the incredible feeling when she was expecting a baby, when she had already prepared a dowry for the future baby. But it had not been born, all because of her husband. Coming back to the real world from her memories, she remembered that she was now a prisoner. But glancing at the soles of her feet, she noticed that the shackles were gone. It turns out that while Sylvia was asleep, Jana came in and took off her shackles. And now this morning she brought her breakfast. The punishment came to an end. After tomorrow, Sylvia could go outside and begin her duties. Did Jana have any sympathy at all? Sylvia left her dungeon and got to work. She had a mountain of dishes to wash, laundry to hang, and floors to sweep. It was a lot of work. By evening she was very tired, for the day seemed too long for her. She remembered that she'd left Kale all alone. He must be fully recovered by now, since she'd been gone for days. He probably didn't need his help anymore. When everyone was asleep, Sylvia decided to check on him. She took food with her again and went into the forest. When she got to the spot where she'd left him, Kale wasn't there. He was gone. It wasn't surprising, though, since she'd been gone for days. This made her very sad, for deep down she had hoped that he would be waiting for her. However, he did not leave. As she thought back to him, she heard the sound of footsteps. When she turned around, she saw Kale himself. He even threw his arms around her, which was unexpected but very nice. In an embrace, they stood for a while. She scrutinized his body and noticed that the terrible wounds had healed. She looked at his body carefully and noticed that the terrible wounds had healed. He stood and looked at her face. They talked, or at least tried to make contact. Sylvia thought he didn't need her anymore, for he was well enough to do without her. In fact, she thought she was being extremely foolish. She should be terrified, but Sylvia wasn't terrified at all. She still couldn't understand what he was thinking, though. Not only that, but there were tears visible on Kale's face, and that was probably what shocked her the most. He clearly wanted to kiss her. Kale leaned toward her and Sylvia pushed him away with force. She couldn't. As they stood looking at each other, Finna appeared. She let out a loud growl. When Sylvia saw her, she was very frightened. And with good reason. The dragon looked very intimidating. It was huge. Kale realized that Finna was going to defend him, so he yelled with all his might for her not to. He ran and stood between Finna and Sylvia, blocking the girl with him. But Finna made a tug that made Sylvia fall over. She started sniffing her. Then she started rubbing her head, purring softly. Kale leaned over Sylvia. Next to him was Finna. Sylvia was still unconscious. Kale leaned over her but noticed the blood caked on her chest. Someone had probably bitten her. Since Sylvia was still unconscious, Kale decided to examine her body. He lifted her easily, threw her over his knee, and made a cut in her clothes. He saw many bloody marks on her back. He didn't know what had happened to her or who could have done such a thing. Kale realized she had been abused. He remembered the day she had last seen him. He had heard someone calling for Sylvia then. Kale was very angry at whoever had done this to the girl. But let's move on to events that took place 6 years ago. Kale was in the king's castle at the time. He scrutinized the ring lying in the palm of his hand. There was a knock at the door, and Cal, the king's son, appeared on the threshold. His father had sent him. Cal knew where Kale might be. The king wanted Kale to return to the ball, but he wasn't going back. He had his reasons. The gala was for Kale's 18th birthday. He knew about it. Moreover, the king even gave him a ring for his bride-to-be to wear. Cal thought that Kale would be happy to find a wife. But he didn't think so, for he was a bastard. Hardly any girl would want a husband like that. In fact, Kale didn't want a family. Well, he had one. Cal, his father. And that was enough for him. Cal said that the ring Kale was holding was unusual. It had been made especially for him. And it had a secret, a special mechanism that would not allow it to be removed once the ring was put on. Then Kale cried out. Since that was the case, he would never wear that ring. Cal tried to convince his brother that he needed the ring. It represented a long tradition, but Cal kept resisting. The thing is, he was a romantic of sorts. He'd probably marry someday, but it would be for love. This conversation was tiring Cal somewhat. Then he grabbed Cal by the shoulders and gave him a good shake, reminding him that he was the crown prince of the proud Red clan. and the one he would marry would become a great princess, and that was not to be forgotten. This marriage will give her wealth, status, happiness. She will not know hunger and poverty. You could say that this ring represented freedom. Cale kept holding Sylvia gently in his arms. How he wished he could free her from the excruciating pain, but there was nothing he could do to her. He could, however, make her his princess. That was something he could do. Cale carefully carried the girl to safety and covered her with some sort of blanket. When she woke up, she didn't realize where she was. Her back appeared bandaged, and next to it the monster slept peacefully. Cale came back from hunting. He had brought fish. Finna greeted him cheerfully as if he were a good old friend. Sylvia involuntarily marveled at this unusual sight. She realized that this terrible beast belonged to Cale. Sylvia tried to ask him where they were, but Cale still answered her in his own incomprehensible language. And then he took out a ring and put it on her finger. Sylvia couldn't come to her senses. She didn't understand what was going on and why she had a ring on her finger. Cale tried to explain in his own language, but Sylvia couldn't understand him. Eventually, she realized that Cale had been talking about marrying her, and that shocked her to say the least. She wasn't going to marry him. Tried to get rid of the ring, but it wouldn't come off her finger. He was still trying to explain something to her, but Sylvia wouldn't listen. She thought Cale was just crazy. In the end, she just decided to run away from him. Cale tried to stop her, but Sylvia was a determined girl. She believed that the decision to marry could not be made alone. Besides, she had to go home. She fisted her will to fight back, but her stomach told her she was hungry. Sylvia was furious at everything that was happening. Cale held out his hand to help her stand up. Sylvia was somewhat confused. She didn't understand what she should do. Cale was very friendly and nice. She accepted his help, but her thoughts were not happy at all. She was by herself in a cave with a madman, and there was a ring on her finger. There was something to be mad about. Cale had built a fire and was going to cook fish on it. Sylvia did not understand why he was doing all this. As we remember, Cale had recently felt the same way. Sylvia tasted the cooked fish. It was very tasty. But instead of thanking him for the treat, she made a displeased face. She'd better think she didn't like it. But even then, her stomach played against her. Oh well, I'll have to agree with him. All the fish was quickly eaten. Not a piece of it was left. When Sylvia had had enough to eat, she made another speech about her desire to leave. She showed everything with gestures. Sylvia screamed that she wasn't going to marry her kidnapper, but Cale didn't understand her language, and she didn't understand his. In the end, Sylvia simply stated that he would not be happy with a woman like her. There would only be lies in such a marriage. In fact, he knew absolutely nothing, but she was sure that if Cale had known more about her life, he would have left her. Knowing that he would understand her, she decided to tell him. She had once been very naive and always dreaming. Most of all, she wanted to love and seek adventure. Then she married someone who promised her the world. God, what a fool she was. In the end, her husband only loved her because of the dream, and when she couldn't give him what he wanted, he just left her. She cried bitterly, feeling sorry for herself. What scared her most about Kayla was her kindness, but she knew perfectly well that it couldn't go on like this for much longer. So when he tried to touch her, she turned away, and deep down she wanted so badly to trust him. It was night. They built a fire and made some sort of soft bedding around it. They laid soft grass on the floor and covered themselves with blankets. Cale, however, did not sleep. He kept looking at the sleeping Sylvia and didn't understand why she was reacting the way she was. He was sure the proposal would make her happy. He was trying to save her. Finna was lying nearby. She had a very sad look on her face. At first, Cale thought she was just hungry, but she wasn't. Then he guessed that Finna was feeling lonely since she was at a distance from Cale and Sylvia. Cale sighed and allowed the dragon to approach them. That made Finna happy. She crawled closer to Sylvia, snuggled up next to her, and began to rumble contentedly. And Cale kept thinking about Sylvia. Maybe he'd been too quick. Sylvia had been through a lot. It would take time for her to trust him. What could he do to help her? An idea popped into his head. He should find her some clothes. A princess-to-be can't go around in rags. With that thought, he ran into the woods. Cale managed to find the house where Sylvia used to live. I'm sure you can find some clothes there. He made his way to the gate and began to carefully peek inside. A very unpleasant scene appeared before his eyes. A man stood with a whip, and beside him was a girl kneeling on her knees. She was apologizing for being unnecessary with the Lord, but her pleas were not heeded. The girl was punished. As there was no one else in sight, Cale ran towards the house. He didn't understand how Sylvia could live in this place of constant pain and humiliation. He went inside and was surprised at the rich decoration of the house. There was cozy furniture and paintings on the walls. He was quite frightened, for he was trespassing. His heart was beating very hard. He remembered trying to steal when he was a kid. One day he wanted to steal coins from a wealthy nobleman, but he was literally caught by the hand, and now he feels like a thief again. As Cale stood thinking, he heard the master reprimanding Jana, the slave overseer. It was about Sylvia. The master shouted at her, for Sylvia was considered their best healer, and unwanted rumors began to spread among the servants. Jana made the excuse that people were looking for a fugitive. But the master was not interested in excuses. He kept shouting and calling Jana a useless old hag. But it didn't end with just shouting. The owner raised his hand against the old woman, and Kale continued to hide and listen to their conversation. Jana said that Sylvia was probably already dead, but there was no proof of that. But the scouts found our camp torn apart by wild beasts. As they chatted, Kale climbed the stairs and began to make his way down the corridor. He found a door of some kind and opened it. A bedroom stood before him. In the room, he found a wardrobe and opened it. There were many men's clothes on the shelves and hangers. Probably the room he found belonged to the owner. He didn't like stealing, but he had no other choice. Of all the things, he chose a snow-white shirt. He also brought boots, a belt, and some other small things. He needed clothes, too. He put all the things he found into a bag. Kale promised himself that this was the last time he would do this. As he walked out the door, he heard someone's footsteps. Someone was coming up the stairs. Kale couldn't stand around waiting to be discovered. He hid in the room again, but in a different room. He was in luck, for this turned out to be the woman's bedroom. He was sure to find something that would suit Sylvia. Opening the wardrobe, he found a lot of women's clothes. It was just a stroke of luck. He grabbed the first dress he could find, and imagined how happy Sylvia would be to see him and throw herself around his neck. But the pleasant reverie was interrupted. Turns out Kale had found himself in the room of the owner's daughter. While he was daydreaming, she walked in. Of course, she couldn't just stand there and watch someone rummage through her things, so she started calling for help. Kale quickly ran to the window, hoping to escape. At the girl's screams, her father and his men came running. The young lady said that a thief had been here, but had escaped through the window. Kale leaned against the wall as he climbed out. He couldn't see him from above. Kale managed to get out of the castle safely, and he immediately rushed over to Sylvia. When he arrived, he saw that the fire had long since gone out. Finna was a fire-breathing dragon and helped to make it hot again. Sylvia just woke up. He immediately handed her a gift. Sylvia realized that Kale wanted her to try on the dress. Since her clothes had become veritable rags, the dress came in handy. But she wasn't going to undress in front of him and the dragon, so she asked them to leave. Sylvia put on the dress. She liked it very much. She thought she must be wearing the same dress as the young mistress. Sylvia noticed that the dress was embroidered with the initials DV, so it really belonged to the Lord's daughter. Sylvia was just angry. She'd never been a thief, and now she was, thanks to Kale. Sylvia clutched her head. She didn't know how to make Kale understand the simple truth. If she came back, they would kill her anyway, because stealing was hardly forgivable. She took a stick and decided to draw. Maybe that way he'll realize what he's done. She would point her finger at him and repeat that he was a thief. It was a word he was very familiar with. When he was a boy, he had been brought to the king's father's palace. One of his men had called him a little thief, not a prince. But the king had another good son, and the man who shouted the hurtful words didn't understand why the nasty bastard had been brought into these walls. The king then shouted that the boy should be given a chance. He had done a bad thing not because he was bad, but because he had no other choice. Kale said something like an apology. Maybe it wasn't true, but that's what Sylvia had heard. She rejoiced. If Kale was really sorry, she wanted to go home. And she drew pictures of it all. That was the kind of communication Kale understood. He took the stick from her, crossed her drawing, and said firmly, "No." Kale went back to that memory again. Then the counselor was reminded that Kale was still the royal son, even despite his actions. And besides, he was the second prince, and for that alone, he was to be respected. The king was in full agreement and said he would not tolerate such accusations any longer. Kale could feel perfectly safe in his father's castle. He had nothing to fear here. Kale came back to reality. He had a very determined look on his face. He felt it was his duty to protect Sylvia, and he was going to make her his princess anyway. Sylvia had been in the cave for 5 days. She tried to escape several times, but each time she failed. No new options came to mind. But she hoped that in time she would be able to understand his language, and then she could convince him to let her go. But even though she liked this life better than being a regular slave, Sylvia continued to think of Kale as a kidnapper. She even thought about wishing she had left him when she found him unconscious. But she couldn't do that. As she was scrubbing the dishes, Finna crawled up to her. I wonder if she wants to shine too. Since Finna couldn't talk, she lay down on the ground and started twirling around. It looked very funny. Sylvia thought it was Finna's way of saying yes to her. Sylvia took a piece of cloth and began rubbing Finna's neck. Sylvia noticed scars on her body. What could have happened to her? After a hard day, both Sylvia and Finna fell asleep. Sylvia thought that since she had a friend, things were probably not as bad as they seemed. Their sound sleep was interrupted by Kale. He held some semblance of a saddle in his hand and called out to Finna. As Finna approached, Kale put the construct on her back. Sylvia wondered what it was, for she had never seen anything like it before. Kale said something, but as usual, she didn't understand it. Then he held out his hand to her and asked if she could give him some suso. Since Sylvia didn't know his language, she didn't understand what he was asking for. She handed him something that looked like a coat of arms, but it was not a suso. Cale remembered that she didn't understand his language. He walked over to her, took her hand and kissed it. The poor girl blushed. Then Cale said with a smile that they were on their way home. At first, Sylvia thought he wanted to take her home, except that he hardly meant her home. That would have been very easy. Cale climbed onto Finna's back and reached out to Sylvia. However, Sylvia turned away. She was not going to indulge his whims. Cale had no choice but to help her onto Finna's back. He lifted Sylvia easily and sat her down behind him. Sylvia didn't seem to like it, but Cale pretended not to notice her angry expression. He was already mentally on his way home. Their journey was beginning. Sylvia had never had to fly a dragon before. At times, Sylvia became very frightened, for she did not realize where she was being taken. But Cale held her hand tightly and reassured her as best he could. At one point, she even fell asleep. Strangely enough, she felt safe with Cale. She was even beginning to think it wasn't as bad as it had seemed in the beginning. At one point, Sylvia was so bold that she even put her arms around Cale's waist, but then quickly removed her hands. Cale pointed his finger somewhere in the distance and told Finna they were flying home. Finna was the most excited about it. However, something went wrong. The fastenings of the seat Sylvia was on tore. She couldn't manage to stay on Finna's back and she rocketed downwards. Cale tried to catch her, but he was unsuccessful. He had no choice but to jump after her. Eventually, he managed to grab her. Finna was next to him. He grabbed onto her. He climbed onto Finna's back and pulled Sylvia tightly to him. Now he was going to hold her tightly. Apparently, this flight had exhausted everyone, even Finna herself. They went flying downhill. Their landing could hardly be called a successful one. But luckily, everyone survived. Cale stood up and held out his hand to her. Sylvia turned away. She thought that he and his carelessness were to blame for everything that had happened. They walked over to Finna. She was lying on the ground. Oh, she must have taken quite a beating. But Finna stood up, twirling her head in different directions. She was fine. Sylvia noticed some beautiful, large purple flowers in the clearing. She crouched down, looking at them. Were they really night lilies? If she remembered correctly, they made good sleeping pills. She plucked one and a flower and thought maybe in these beautiful plants was her key to freedom. And this was the time that Kyle and Finna were acting like children. Finna spotted Sylvia and went over to kiss her. Night had fallen. The whole trio paced along the road. Each thought what to do about it. What if they were lost in this forest? When they looked up at the sky, they noticed that it was all dotted with fireflies. It was a very beautiful sight. And while Sylvia gazed up at the beautiful night sky, Cale stood there thinking how beautiful Sylvia was. How could she show him what she meant to him? Cale exclaimed and showed her the cave whose entrance was hidden by a waterfall. It was a very beautiful place. Cale saw real rose bushes. There were many of them. He picked one rose. Sylvia and Cale stood holding their flowers, each thinking about something different. Sylvia that this time she had a good plan. And Cale that he could show her his attitude this time. Cale immediately went into the waterfall. He enjoyed putting his body under the jets of water. Since he had his back to Sylvia, she could see the wounds on his body from yesterday's fall. They weren't many, but still, Sylvia knew she had to help him. She took her old dress in her hands and began to tear it into strips that could be used to bind his wounded body. Having procured the necessary amount, she offered to bandage his wounds. But he didn't want to and offered to fool around a bit. They played catch-up and Finna was happy to join in the fun. Everyone was just happy. After he'd had enough of running around, he let them dress his wounds. Cale thanked him for taking care of him. When it got dark, they made a fire again and made themselves cozy around it. Sylvia's look was somehow sad, so Cale thought something was wrong and asked her about it. Sylvia didn't even know what to say to him. She was here with him, but she didn't feel free. She was here with him, but she did not feel free. And that made her very depressed. Cale held up a beautiful rose flower to her. He compared her beauty to this bud. Such compliments were nice for any girl to hear, and Sylvia was no exception. Those words made her blush. At times like this, she had the feeling that Cale loved her. Cale put his arm around her. She felt safe around him. She hadn't felt that way in a long time. And then he decided to kiss her. At times like this, she always thought of her ex-husband. She didn't want to feel the same pain her ex-husband had caused her again, and she didn't want it to happen to her again. So she pushed Cale away. He intercepted her hand. Tears came to Sylvia's eyes. She was sad that he didn't understand her. She could never love her captor. While Cale was busy with business, she decided to make a sleeping potion. She remembered the recipe from memory. She remembered him trying to kiss her, and for her that was the last straw. She was busy making a brew and wondering who Cale thought he was. First he kidnapped her, then he kissed her, and then he asked her to marry him. Or forced her to. Maybe he was better than Henry. But Sylvia thought Henry loved her. Was there love? She took the flower and threw it into the pot. The memory of Henry was extremely unpleasant to her. She wanted very much to be free. Meanwhile, Cale was sitting on a stump, carving something with a knife. He was absorbed in his own thoughts. Somehow he was sure that Sylvia felt the same way about him as he did about her. Perhaps he'd gone too far? She didn't seem happy. Perhaps he shouldn't have kissed her, but alas, things couldn't be reversed. He didn't want to lose her. Cale gave himself over to memories. When he was young, he had been in love with a beautiful girl. They used to go out together. When they spotted a deer in the forest, Cale approached it, but the animal trembled and ran away. He decided he had to show her his feelings even without words. He really loved her, and for Sylvia's sake, he carved a deer out of a piece of wood. When Cale returned to the cave, he found Sylvia cooking something. Sylvia said cheerfully as she cooked dinner. Cale looked as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Sylvia looked at him questioningly. Then Cale knelt down before her and said something in his incomprehensible language. Then he presented her with a stag figurine he had made himself. Sylvia wondered what it was. She noted that it was very beautiful, and she realized that Cale had made it himself. She didn't want to be soft right now. Still, she couldn't help herself and thanked him for the gift. She had to keep up the act, though, until Cale tasted the sleeping pill soup she'd made. Sylvia accepted the figurine and immediately put it around her neck. Now you can feed him with the soup you've made. She took a ladle and poured the soup into a bowl. Cale sniffed it first, but did not dare to taste the food offered. But Sylvia looked at him in such a way that he couldn't refuse her. He drank the soup almost immediately. With a nod of his head, he showed that he liked the food. But just after the meal, he felt his eyes begin to close. While Cale and Finna slept, Sylvia put some food in her bag. The night lilies worked very well indeed. Cale fell asleep very soundly, as did Finna. As she put her things away, Sylvia wondered if she had been in too much of a hurry, but it was already done. She covered Cale with a blanket, placed her hand on his and wished him to take care of himself. Then she said goodbye and left. She felt great. How long she had dreamed of freedom, and now it had finally happened. Now she was her own master again. She saw the night lilies again and involuntarily thought of Gianna. Surely they must have searched her out, and one must be constantly on the lookout to avoid falling into a trap. Suddenly a deer jumped out. Sylvia hadn't expected anything like that, and flopped to the ground, hitting herself painfully. The deer reminded her of the figurine that dangled around her neck. She took it off and examined it. She wondered how long it had taken Cale to carve it. She remembered how he had given her the figurine. She thought that night had probably been a simple misunderstanding. She was beginning to regret what had happened. Probably in time they would have been able to work things out and get along. Maybe they could learn each other's words so they could talk. She remembered her ex-husband again. Then he came and told her it was time for her to go. Then she knelt down in front of him and asked him how it was. He had said he would always love her. He'd said at the time that it had once been like that, and now she wasn't worth the effort anymore. Sylvia was crying. She looked at her cut hands and didn't understand how it was possible. Then he pointed his finger at the door and told her to get out. And lastly, he said she shouldn't expect a man to come along who could love her for nothing. The memory made her shudder. She remembered Cale and thought that he wouldn't have done what her ex-husband had done. She didn't want it to end like this, but was there anything she could do to change it? Would he be able to trust her after everything that had happened? She thought she'd been a real fool to dump such a great guy. Aye, so be it, but she'll be back. She would go back to the cave and think she would find a way to understand it. They would learn to talk to each other. But she could not reach the cave. A group of men came out of the forest. They looked very squeamish and were clearly delighted with this find. They grabbed her and held their prey tightly. Sylvia struggled and begged to be let go, but it was not to be. They ended up beating her badly. There were abrasions and bruises on her face. The men were celebrating such a successful hunt, and to prevent the captive from escaping, she was tied tightly to a tree. The men noticed that the girl was awake. Sylvia decided to wonder who they were and what they wanted from her. They came close to her. A nasty smirk flashed across their faces. One of them leaned towards her. Sylvia decided to try to persuade him to let her go. OK said she was heading home, but they weren't going to let her go. Everything they found in the forest, they always took for themselves. Sylvia once again decided to ask to be let go. She suggested that they make a deal. The deal might interest them, but they wanted to know what she could offer in return for her freedom. Since in fact Sylvia had nothing, she simply introduced herself as the daughter of Lord Rosh of Pem Manor. She pointed to the edge of her dress, where her initials were embroidered. She promised to reward them generously if they let them go and to give them as much money as they asked for. The men wondered, what if it was true? They thought that if they accepted the money, they would miss a great chance to talk to such a beautiful girl. And if she never came home, they would have no problem. Sylvia was frightened by those words. She didn't know what else to think of. The leader of the gang didn't like that the girl didn't look at him when he talked to her. He grabbed her roughly. Sylvia was already mentally saying goodbye to Cale and asking for his forgiveness. However, someone came to the rescue. An arrow was thrust into the robber. The bandits became frightened as they could not see the enemy and grouped themselves together. The arrows fell one after another. The enemy ranks were thinning. There was panic among them. Then one of them took out a knife and put it to Sylvia's neck. This was his way of luring out the invisible enemy. Cale appeared out of the woods. Sylvia screamed and warned him of the danger. But he wasn't alone. He had his faithful Finna with him. She bellowed menacingly and threw herself at the first brigand she saw. He had a knife. He managed to get it out and plunge it into Finna's body. But such a small knife was hard to use against a huge dragon. Finna twisted round and let the fire out. While Finna was fighting her opponent, Kale was also fighting. But he couldn't see what was going on behind him. And there was another bandit coming at him with a knife in his hand. Sylvia blurted out, hoping Kale would understand her. He turned round, saw the danger, and in one precise movement knocked the knife out of his opponent's hands. Kale and Finna managed to take out all of their opponents. Sylvia still couldn't believe that Kale had come to save her. After all, she had poisoned him. Kale bent down and cut the ropes that bound Sylvia. She didn't even know what to say or where to start talking. Gaining courage, she just began to utter words of remorse. But Kale just picked her up and grabbed her in his arms. He carried Sylvia back to the cave. The faithful Finna was beside him. Oddly enough, the one who felt guilty about Sylvia running away was Kale. He thought he was no better than those brigands. He thought he could save her and make her happy. Sylvia and Finna were sleeping sweetly. When they woke up, Finna decided to show all her tenderness. She licked Sylvia, and it felt good. When Sylvia woke up, she saw that Kale was busy cooking fish. He immediately asked if she was hungry. It seemed to Sylvia that he was not angry with her. She sat closer to him and thanked him for her rescue. Blushing, she apologized for what she had done. Kale shook her head as if to show that she had nothing to apologize for. He took her hand and cracked the ring. She was free now. Sylvia kept looking at her hand and couldn't believe that Kale would let her go like that. He asked her for forgiveness himself. He handed her a bag of supplies, a knife. Only now she didn't want to leave. She took his hands and told him she would never marry her kidnapper, even though he didn't understand her language, but on a subconscious level he guessed what she was talking about. Sylvia admitted that she could probably love someone who saved her life. She took the ring and put it around the neck of the gifted figurine. Now she had a choice to wear the ring or not. Sylvia snuggled up to him. Kale didn't understand what she was doing, for her behavior had changed dramatically. She looked at him and realized that Kale was far from perfect, but there were no perfect people. Sylvia wasn't perfect either. And then they kissed. Maybe Kale would be her second husband because she couldn't ignore the feelings in her heart. And he could hardly be called a kidnapper. The only thing he could really steal was her heart. Kal looked out from the castle balcony into the distance. The fact was that the king had sent men to search for Kal, and every day he and his son Kal waited for news. They were told that the search party had finally returned, but Kale wasn't with them. One of them reported that my lord's brother was dead. Kal interjected to see if he had heard the information correctly. Those who came explained that Kale had foolishly decided to check on the landers, but they had attacked him and had not spared him. Kal was too angry. He felt there could be no excuses here. They had to keep him safe. They kept making excuses that they fought hard, but there was simply no chance of winning. Kal turned to his father. He was determined and too angry. He wanted revenge for his brother's death. The king hesitated. He thought it might be too dangerous to engage in battle. They could not denounce their land and the land of dragons. Father had strictly forbidden revenge. Kal, however, was of a very different opinion. As he left the hall, Kal still promised himself that the Dryads would pay for what they had done. He loved his brother very much, and he was going to get justice, no matter what it cost him. Sylvia enjoyed Kale's company. She was so glad to meet him. He had made her believe in love again. They walked through the woods, rode Finn. He was always polite and courteous to her, catching her as she fell. She really wanted to be with Kale, but there was something that bothered her. She didn't officially become his wife. She even wondered if Kale thought that because he gave her the ring, she was his wife. She was constantly watching the relationship between Kale and Finna. Finna was like a naughty child, and often she just didn't listen to Kale. For example, she grabbed the rope. He asked her to let go, but she didn't seem to hear him. It was all so cute and funny. What was curious was that if Sylvia addressed her, Finn obeyed her. And Kale was somewhat upset about it since Finna was his dragon. Sylvia was troubled by her thoughts about being married. She thought she should tell Kale about her doubts. She turned to him. She tried and tried to talk about her wish, but she could not find the right words. In the end, Sylvia thought there was no point in beating around the bush and shouted that she wanted to have a wedding ceremony. Just don't forget that Kale still didn't quite understand her language, so he looked at her questioningly. With incredible persistence, Sylvia repeated that she would like to marry officially and pointed to the stag figurine with the ring. But Kale didn't quite know what she meant. He took the figurine in his hands, twirled it around. He already thought it was his. It was very difficult to talk to him, for he did not understand speech. She would say one thing to him and he would stand there and smile. Then she decided to give him a lesson in marriage. She picked some flowers and made a bouquet for herself as a bride, danced the wedding dance with him. But even now he didn't understand anything. It pissed her off terribly. He understood everything she did in his own way. He was very nice and courteous to her, but he didn't understand what she wanted from him. Sylvia possessed simply straw-like patience. She would still find a way to make him understand her. Kale kept thinking about home. It had been a long time since he'd left it. He reminisced about his father as he missed him and talking to him very much. He remembered his friends. Their betrayal had put him in this place. He could not understand why they had done this to him. He watched Sylvia and Finna sleeping sweetly, but he had to move on. They set off again on the road. The surrounding scenery was simply mesmerizing. In this way, they wandered for several days. Sylvia was even tired from such a long walk. Looks like Kale just got lost. She would have liked to help him so much, but she didn't know where he came from. And this area wasn't familiar to her. Sylvia saw something that looked like a town in the woods and immediately pointed it out to Kale. She thought they should go there, but Kale was against it. Sylvia couldn't understand why not. She had apparently forgotten about Finna's existence. The townspeople wouldn't know how they'd feel about a dragon. Then she suggested leaving Finna here. But Kale was against that as well. She was too insistent in her desires. Kale had to agree, even though he didn't want to at all. Sylvia was anxious to get into town before dark. But the long hike must have worn Kale out. She was constantly pushing him forward. Finally, they got into the city. It was quite large. They looked at the houses, the streets. Kale was constantly tense. Sylvia kept her hand on his arm to reassure him. However, he was still constantly on guard. What if they were in danger here? The people of the town regarded the couple with interest. Kale kept Sylvia near him at all times, showing that she was with him. They got to the bazaar, but Sylvia was not interested in the trader's offers. She had an idea she wanted to realize. She wanted her and Kale to be married, and for that she needed to find a temple. Sylvia kept looking around, hoping to see the spires of the building. And finally, her efforts were rewarded. She had found what she was looking for. She took Kale's hand and dragged him behind her. At last, they found themselves at the door of the temple. They went inside, where they were met by the priest. He immediately asked what he could do to help. Sylvia said they would like to get married. The priest wondered who would marry at such a late hour. But Sylvia asked with tears in her eyes, and he couldn't resist a crying woman. The priest agreed to marry them, but the favor cost money. He quoted a price of 15 silver coins, but they had no money. Sylvia tearfully continued to ask the priest to marry them, but the priest persisted. He had to draw up the official papers, and they had a price. In the end, the priest had no choice but to send them out the door. He was not going to work for free. They had to wander the streets of the city again. Sylvia was very upset, because she had hoped so much that she would become Kale's official wife. She kept thinking about the 15 silver coins that needed to be paid to the priest. Where would she earn that much? They came across a shop with bread pastries. They were very hungry, but they had no money even for a piece of fresh bread, which beckoned with its appetizing appearance. Kale could have decorated bread for her, but he didn't. He kept holding himself back. He grabbed Sylvia's hand and dragged her somewhere. They came into the shop. There was a lot of stuff. Poor Sylvia's eyes began to run wild at the abundance of goods. The only wealth Kale had was the locket. He was willing to sacrifice it for Sylvia. The salesman realized he had a bad customer, but he could have sold him a great locket. Sylvia tried to stop Kale. She realized that the locket was of special value to him. She'd said they didn't need the money that badly. But Kale was as determined as she was. The seller was able to offer 20 silver coins for the locket. Sylvia thought it was too little, but she didn't know how much the thing might be worth. Then the seller held out a handful of coins to her and said he was willing to buy the locket for 30, but that would be the highest price he could offer. Sylvia remembered the wounded Kale she had found in the forest then. What if this locket had special value to him? She realized that only an idiot would call this a good deal. But another young man approached them. He happened to overhear their conversation with the merchant. He offered to sell him the medallion for 70 silver coins. That was twice as much as the junk dealer offered them. The old man didn't like some brat trying to take customers away from him and started chasing him away. The young man didn't mind not getting involved in this situation, but the junk dealer was trying to cheat these people by offering them too small a price for their goods. In the end, the young man suggested that they go to another shop. He saw that the young men were hesitant. Sylvia wondered if they had come all this way for nothing. It was only a short time before her dream of becoming Kale's official wife would be realized. They accepted the young man's invitation, held hands, and followed him. He led them to the best tent in town. You could really find everything you needed here. There were a really wide variety of goods on the counter. There were weapons, food, and drinks. The seller suggested they get back to business. He asked if they would be willing to sell the locket for that price. Since Sylvia didn't know anything about it anyway, she asked Kale to decide for himself. He agreed to give the medallion for 70 coins. The deal was done. The seller got the medallion, Sylvia and Kale got the coins. Everyone was satisfied. When they became rich, the first thing Kale offered to do was to buy food, for they were very hungry indeed. They bought food and other things. At last they had enough to eat, for they had not eaten properly for days. They went back to the temple again. The priest opened the door for them again and asked if there was anything he could do to help them. Sylvia handed him a bag of coins. She was so happy that he couldn't refuse her. He invited them to go inside the building. The necessary documents for the ceremony were already ready. Kale and Sylvia only needed to sign the papers. When the papers were signed, the priest opened his Talmud and began to read. Sylvia and Kale held hands. The priest asked the standard questions. Do they vow to love each other, to be faithful and honest to the end of their days, and to spend the rest of their lives as a married couple? Sylvia swore at once. So the priest turned to Kale, but he did not know that the boy did not understand his language. Kale stood there, not understanding what was being asked of him. Sylvia came to the rescue. She took his hands and asked him to repeat the word. He said. The priest pronounced them husband and wife. Both looked extremely happy. Now she would always be his. The locket Kale had sold had belonged to his mother. He remembered her often and longed for her. He was sad to have to part with the medallion, but circumstances demanded it. Even though they had become husband and wife, Kale was shy of Sylvia, so to speak. He was embarrassed when he saw her in the bathroom. At that moment, he blushed heavily. All he wanted was to make her happy. It should be noted that they were staying in a motel. The room was quite inexpensive, 6 coins. It was quite spacious and comfortable. Sylvia still couldn't believe that she had become Kale's real wife, but the new position meant more than mutual affection. It was caring for each other. When Kale came out of the bath, his head was still wet. Sylvia threw a towel over him so he wouldn't catch cold. In the room, she showed him the bed where they would sleep. They had never slept on a bed before, always on some kind of bedding. Kale thought that this bed was just for her, but she said it was for the two of them. Kale even felt uncomfortable and blushed profusely. He sat her down on the bed and put his arm around her. At first, Sylvia wanted to resist as usual, but they were already husband and wife. There was no point in being nervous now. They have become real newlyweds and they need to learn to trust each other. They even kissed, but they were still unaccustomed to everything. Kale was even sweating a little from the exertion, and Sylvia's eyes filled with tears. He looked at her and didn't know why she was crying. He doesn't hurt her. He even decided to apologize to her. He didn't really know why. For bringing her to tears, I guess. But Sylvia said he had nothing to do with it. He was not the cause of her tears, and he had nothing to apologize for. He wanted to understand what was going on with her. She was basically crying about herself. She still hadn't told him the truth about herself. If he knew more about her, he would be able to understand many of her actions. Sylvia decided to pluck up the courage to tell him the truth. She couldn't have children. 3 times she let her ex-husband down. That's why he left her. She wondered what if the same pain she inflicted on Kale. She didn't want that in any way. Now she was apologizing to him for forcing Kale to marry her. She felt very bad and thought she had been selfish. Maybe that was partly true. Kale didn't turn away from her after hearing her confession. He pulled her close to him and kissed her gently on the forehead. She looked at him with her big eyes. Did he still not understand what she was saying to him? He in turn continued to declare his love for her. Alas, Kale did not understand her. She wondered how he could comfort her if he didn't understand. How could he have so much warmth in him? She realized that the past couldn't be changed, and she had to stop remembering everything that had happened before. Now she had Kale, and with him, everything was completely different. If she didn't stop thinking about Henry all the time, she wouldn't be able to move forward. But she really wanted things to be different with Kale. Let all the pain and sadness be in the past. After a pretty hard day, they were finally able to settle down and fall asleep. They slept in each other's arms. Being near him, she was no longer afraid. The merchant to whom Kale had sold the medallion came into the tavern. He walked over to the notice board and began to scrutinize the information. One poster in particular caught his eye. It had a picture of the girl he had seen with the strange guy with the locket. The advert said that the girl was wanted. Kale even had a dream that he and Sylvia were sleeping on silk bed linen, and judging by the position of their bodies, something had happened between them during the night. Poor Kale even woke up with a startle. He looked at the sweetly sleeping Sylvia and couldn't hold back a smile. He saw her back again, mottled with many scars. He ran his fingers down her back first. He realized that the girl had been through a lot of trouble. Then he began to kiss her wounded back. He vowed to himself that he would never let anyone else hurt her, his princess. In the morning, Sylvia woke up. She stretched sweetly and decided to wonder what time it was. Kale was also sleeping sweetly beside him. When he woke up, he looked extremely charming. He wished Sylvia a good morning. She had completely forgotten about last night. They had become husband and wife. When Kale hugged her, the color rushed to her cheeks. Sylvia looked like a ripe tomato. Kale kept telling her she was his. He hugged her gently. Even though he spoke in a language she didn't understand, Sylvia knew what he was saying on a gut level, and the gentle touch spoke for itself. While they were kissing, the owner of the place knocked on the door. He wondered if they would stay another night. Sylvia shouted that they would be leaving soon. She thought there was no point in their staying here any longer. In the meantime, those who called themselves Kale's friends set out to meet his enemy. They had been walking for a long time and they were even tired. They were promised a handsome reward for what they did. At last they came to the right place. It was a camp. It's worth noting that Kale's betrayal was simply forced upon them. Their enemies seized their children and blackmailed them with their lives. The little ones were chained together. Seeing their own children in this horrible place, the guys couldn't help but cringe. They were angry. At last they could hug their little ones. They were thanked for their good work. The boys didn't really betray Kale. There was an enemy in the king's entourage who had started the whole thing. He didn't like Kale, but he couldn't remove the prince on his own. So he had to go to such measures in the form of blackmail. This vile type threatened that if they told anyone about the reasons for Kale's real death, they and their families would be tried for treason. He thought Kale was no good to the kingdom. Kale's friends could do nothing. They were too few in number, and the enemy army outnumbered them. They were really sure Kale was dead. They'd seen him injured and unconscious. Yet somewhere in the back of their minds they believed Kale was alive. He was too strong to die like that. One of his friends was 100% sure of that. He wanted the prince to come home as soon as possible. Kale and Sylvia went wandering around the town again. Sylvia decided she needed to buy some food and went to the shop. She picked up some bread vegetables. It's nice to be able to take out and buy food. Kale also went to the shop. He needed to buy a new dagger. The knife he had was no longer good for anything. Kale stood and chose which one to take. It should be noted that the choice was really hard. Each dagger looked perfect. They held hands all the time. Sylvia still found it hard to believe everything that was happening. It was so nice to be loved and appreciated for nothing but for nothing. Kale finally made his choice. A dainty dagger with a long, sharp blade caught his eye. Kale was very fond of the dagger itself. The seller had quoted a price of 25 coins for it. Since there were still coins from the sale of the medallion, Kale bought the dagger. Meanwhile, Sylvia kept wandering round the market. She looked at the jewelry, the beautiful clothes. She wanted to buy something for herself. They had already spent quite a lot of the coins, but something kept catching their attention. This time, Kale pointed her to the green cloth cape. It was very pretty. Kale offered to try it on. The cape was made of soft fabric. When Sylvia put it on, it looked very nice on her. She looked expensive and elegant in it. In the shop they entered, there were many different clothes. There were also shoes. Kale offered to try on the boots as well. Sylvia put them on and felt very comfortable. The boots were warm and soft. Her feet were very cold in her old shoes. Kale gestured to the saleswoman that they were buying both the boots and the cape. Together it all cost 15 coins. Sylvia wanted to buy these things so badly, but the 15 coins were the last they had left. She thanked the friendly saleswoman but said they couldn't afford it right now. Kale insisted on buying it. It was very cold outside and Sylvia only had a dress. She was always freezing in it. The saleswoman decided to give them a discount. She was willing to sell the items for only 10 coins. It was a good deal, and the items were of really good quality. They bought them and continued on their way. Thanks to Kale, she felt spoilt. That's not to say she didn't enjoy those feelings. She cared about her and it felt so good. He was always thinking about her and making her comfortable. He touched his hand to her cheek. It was cold. Kale thought the girl was still freezing. She laughed and said that was totally not true. She was happy. Once again, he pulled her against him and spoke words of love in his own language. Sylvia seemed to understand what he was telling her, and replied that she loved him too. They kissed, but a voice called out to Sylvia. When they turned round, they saw the girl. Sylvia did not recognize her at first. She stood staring at the stranger's face. Kale thought his beloved was in danger and prepared to draw his dagger. Sylvia recognized the girl. It was Fiona. They threw their arms around each other. Kale stood watching them. He didn't know Fiona, and he'd never met her before. Fiona wondered who it was next to her. Her new master. But Sylvia replied that no, it's her savior, and besides, they're married. Fiona was delighted at the news. She'd only read about this sort of thing in novels. In those novels, the heroes often rescued girls to make them their wives, and then lived happily ever after with them. Fiona was genuinely happy for Sylvia, and she couldn't wait to tell Gregory all about it. It turns out he was here too. When Gregory saw Sylvia, he was very surprised. He was so happy to see her that he threw his arms around her. Sylvia was also delighted with this pleasant encounter. But apparently everyone forgot that Sylvia wasn't alone. But Fiona had warned her new husband might be jealous. Sylvia told Kale that they were her mates. They wouldn't hurt them. Kale held back. Fiona came from Sylvia's home village. She said that since Sylvia was now free, she had to come and visit her father's home. Fiona said a lot of people back home were asking about Sylvia. Sylvia touched Kale's shoulder and said that she would like to visit the house. But Kale felt that they needed to move on. On the whole, Sylvia was in complete agreement with him. But he felt guilty in front of her and agreed. If it was necessary to visit home, it was necessary. He understood her perfectly well, for he himself felt a longing for his nest. They got into the carriage and drove off. The whole way Kale was pensive. Sylvia was chattering merrily with her friends and he was on his own. Besides, he didn't know what they were talking about. But he was sure that everything would be fine. At least as long as they didn't procrastinate. The following events were again developing in the country of Kiel. The young man had a meeting. He asked the name of the uninvited visitors. They did not give their names, but they said that the king had forbidden to attack the inhabitants of the land and that no one would support him. The young man roared and slammed his fist into the wall. Would no one support him even for the sake of the young prince? If so, they should find someone who is out of their mind. The visitors reported that there was a princess from the Blue Clan. There were incredible rumors about her. People thought she was very strong and crazy. Meanwhile, Kale, Sylvia, and her friends have returned to their home village. Fiona ran to the house where her grandmother lived. The old woman opened the door. Fiona was showing who came with her. The woman dropped the rolling pin in surprise and threw her arms around Sylvia. Both of them were happy to see each other. Sylvia even cried, for she had not been home for a long time. The woman looked at Kale and asked who it was. Sylvia wanted to introduce him herself, but Fiona beat her to it. She said that this was Sylvia's handsome new husband, and he had saved her like a true hero. The woman touched Kale's face. She smiled and said he had kind eyes. She liked him. Kale was incredibly pleased to hear that. He smiled and thanked him for such kind words. Fiona suggested a party to celebrate Sylvia's return. The old lady liked the idea. She decided that she should invite all the neighbors to the party. And that's what Fiona should do. And the guys should go out and get as much firewood as possible for cooking. And Sylvia could stay with her and help with the cooking. It felt so good to be home again. Sylvia couldn't hold back tears of happiness. The party was starting. Guests were arriving at the house. Everyone was happy to see Sylvia back. Kale was forced into the task of arranging the furniture. Even Henry and his new wife and children were invited to the party. That's one person she wouldn't want him at this party. Sylvia pointed her finger at the people he had come with. "Is that his family?" she asked. Henry nodded. His wife's name was Maria. They had been married almost 3 years. Sylvia thought she'd been away from home for just 3 years. Despite all the pain he had caused her, she stood and smiled at him. She was glad that now he had everything he wanted. Henry thanked her for her kind words and said he was glad she was okay too. He said that everyone was trying to stop the debt collector. Sylvia's father had a huge debt and he could not pay it. When Henry found the right moment, he grabbed Sylvia and pulled her against him. He said he was sorry for everything that had happened and missed her very much. But she no longer believed him. This touching scene was seen by Kale and he didn't like it at all. Sylvia pushed Henry away with force, and she snuggled up to Kale. She was married again now. Henry was not happy with this turn of events and asked who it was with her. Sylvia introduced Kale as her husband. It was the truth. Henry looked at the couple very unhappily. He didn't understand why Sylvia had married someone who didn't even speak their language. Sylvia blocked Kale with herself and started to defend him. He's trying to learn her language. He also saved her when no one else was around. But Henry apparently did not know what love was, and did not believe her words. He thought she had tricked a foreigner into marriage to gain her freedom. Sylvia looked at Henry and didn't understand how he could say something like that. And this was the man she had once loved. Now Kale stepped up to his spouse's defense and blocked her from Henry. Henry stood and grinned nastily. He was sure her husband didn't know about her problems at all. Sylvia was very much disgusted with the man. What right had he to think that if he did not love her, no one else would love her? But it was useless to say anything to Henry. The one thing he was always good at was bullying others. But he couldn't continue the monologue. Kale didn't like the man. He realized he was hurting Sylvia, so he smashed his fist into the man's pleased face. Henry fell with a clatter, holding on to the bruised spot. Kale was pleased that he was finally able to stretch his fists. Sylvia tried to stop the fight that was brewing. She clung to Kale with a deadening grip. Henry stood up, wiped his bruised nose, and got back at Cade by punching him. They got into a big fight. Kale wondered how this guy knew Sylvia and why she was always crying for him. In the end, the fighters were separated. There were a lot of ladies at the party. They were frightened by the fight. Kale glared menacingly at his opponent. He gave her a warning look as if to warn her not to even try to approach her. In spite of everything, the feast went on as usual. People were drinking, eating, and talking among themselves. But as Kale and Henry sat across from each other, lightning flew between them. Sylvia thought it was all her fault. Some little girl ran up to her, shook her by the sleeve, and asked if Sylvia would stay with them. Sylvia shook his head and said no. They were going to go back to Kale's house, but Henry was still going on. He asked Sylvia if she knew where the crazy savage came from. Kale realized that his beloved was being harassed again and was already preparing his fists. A little more and a fight might have broken out again. However, Fiona warned her. She stood up and said enough was enough. Henry was furious. He didn't understand how they could accept a stranger they knew nothing about. They didn't even understand his speech. He blamed Kale for the whole mess. Fiona's grandmother decided to put an end to the argument. She said that it was only because of Kale that Sylvia had been able to come home. She didn't understand why Henry couldn't just be happy for her. Strangely enough, these words made Henry feel ashamed. He realized that he was no longer welcome here. He decided to leave the party. Sylvia was very sorry for the way things had turned out. Grigory comforted her. You shouldn't have got upset about all this. Henry should learn to understand his own mistakes. Fiona suggested that we forget all the unpleasant things that had happened on this holiday. And everyone present cheered. They promised Sylvia a fun party. The fun continued. The guests were still walking around, chatting amongst themselves. Kale kept to himself. He was a stranger here and he didn't really know anyone. He was approached by Grigory. He offered him a drink of good old beer. I guess beer was a new drink for Cale. But he liked it. Now he joined in the fun. Fiona was suddenly bored. She wouldn't have minded music. However, it was a kind of distraction. She just didn't want the men to get drunk. And the men all continued to sit at the table and drink beer. When Cale heard the music, he turned round. The first to get up from the table was Grigory. The ladies wanted to dance, so why not give them that joy? Everyone got up and started dancing. Even Cale decided to ask Sylvia to dance, much to her surprise. He behaved like a real gentleman, making Sylvia blush. No one had ever treated her so gently before. On the other hand, it was very pleasant, even if it was a little unusual. People continued to twirl in a dance to the enchanting sounds of the music. And Cale continued to surprise Sylvia. It turned out he could dance well. Every time she thought about it, she wondered how much she didn't know about him, and how much she still had to learn. They twirled in a dance, hugging and kissing each other. His touching care was pleasant, and at this point it was enough to make her feel happy. The only thing Cale didn't like was Henry, who kept watching Sylvia. It made Cale very angry. He didn't understand why he kept looking at her and who she was, but he didn't want to get into any more fights because that would upset Sylvia. But he wanted everyone to realize that Sylvia was his wife. And to prove it, Cale lifted Sylvia gently into his arms. All of this disliked Henry very much. He didn't see how anyone could be interested in her. But Cale enjoyed pissing Henry off, and to finish him off, he not only carried Sylvia in his arms but carried her into the house. Morning came. Sylvia and Cale slept in the same bed, for they had become husband and wife. It would have been strange if they had occupied different rookeries. Sylvia woke up, stretched. She hadn't thought the morning would come so quickly. She would have loved to nap for a few more hours. Cale continued to sleep sweetly and snore. He'd had a good time last night after all, so he was hungover today. The thought made Sylvia smile. She thought she shouldn't wake him up, let him sleep a few hours more. She covered him with a blanket. I left the room. Grandmother and Fiona were working on breakfast. Sylvia thanked them for the room and said she had slept very well. Fiona decided to ask Sylvia to help her go shopping. Let it be a thank you for the night's accommodation. Sylvia happily agreed. And how could she refuse? She had always been very kind and helpful. They went shopping and shared their impressions of the party. Sylvia was satisfied with everything. She'd had a lot of fun that day, and if she could persuade Cale to move here, she and Fiona would go shopping all the time. But I don't think that's possible. Fiona was upset by this, of course, but there was nothing she could do about it. She only asked Sylvia to visit her more often, and she agreed to do everything she could to see Fiona and the others more often. They approached the house of Sylvia's father, with whom she had not the happiest of memories. Sylvia was even a little frightened and trembled, but Fiona convinced her that there was nothing to be afraid of. Father hadn't been here for a long time. That was the reason he wasn't at the party. Sylvia decided to go into the house and look around a bit. She hadn't been here in years. She opened the door and immediately noticed the dust. It was true that her father had been gone for a long time. She looked around at the shelves, the furniture, and was surprised to realize that despite everything, she still missed him. She thought back to him and wondering if he would have liked Cale and what he would have said. While Sylvia was exploring the house, Henry came through the door. He said that her father loved her very much. Sylvia couldn't believe his words, but Henry once again said that her father loved her very much and cursed himself many times for what he had done. Then Henry approached Sylvia and told her that there was a rumor that his guilt had pulled him into the river. She didn't understand what this conversation was about, so she asked Henry. It turned out that he was also regretting the past. She wanted to leave, but Henry wasn't going to just let her go. He didn't care about Cale. He was sorry for what had happened and he wanted to make it right. Except Sylvia wasn't interested in any of that anymore. Henry didn't want to listen to her, though. Eventually, he took her and kissed her. Meanwhile, Cale continued to sleep peacefully, unaware of what was going on. If he knew the whole truth, he'd be sure to give Henry a good beating. When he woke up, he felt a severe headache. His head felt like it was splitting. It was not surprising because he had had a lot to drink last night. He noticed that Sylvia wasn't around. Where had she gone? He went outside, where he was immediately blinded by the bright sun. He wanted to find Sylvia, but instead he saw his grandmother. She was holding a glass of milk. He asked her for a drink and wondered where Sylvia was. The older woman said that she had gone shopping with Fiona. She is sure that Sylvia is all right and that he is worrying now for nothing. Cale wondered why Sylvia had left without him. Maybe she was angry because he'd slept a long time. Should he wait for her to return? He was really worried about her and he wanted her to come back safely. Meanwhile, Henry continued to hug and kiss her. He said they were made for each other. Meanwhile, she was thinking about something else entirely. She didn't know what to do. She thought Henry had gone mad. She regretted her helplessness and realized that she couldn't wait every time for someone to come and save her. Henry didn't seem to notice her distress. He kept talking to her about love. Sylvia stood there wondering what she could do. There was something she could really do. And then the bottle caught her eye. And while Henry kept whispering words to her, she took it. I smashed it on the table and hit Henry over the head with it. He fell back, clutching his head. His hands frantically groped for the bruised area, which was bleeding profusely. Sylvia stood holding the broken bottle. She was surprised at her courage. And then she took off and headed for the exit. Henry continued to whisper words of love to her. Apparently, he managed to get Sylvia. She turned round and declared that the only person Henry loved was himself. She didn't think she was perfect, but she thought she deserved to be taken and thrown out like a helpless kitten, and that she could never forgive him. Henry made another attempt. He said that her new husband would be just like him, for he could not even understand her. Sylvia clasped her hands to her chest and said that she didn't need any words, because Cale was showing her that he loved her with his attitude. And not just one thing, but everything. Sylvia said goodbye to Henry and left. He sat with his head bowed. Yes, Sylvia was completely different. Sylvia went back to her friend's house and told them everything that had happened. Sylvia felt that she had only herself to blame. Friends, including Gregory, thought that Sylvia shouldn't blame herself for everything. Henry was an adult to be responsible for his own actions. While they were sitting and talking, they heard the door creak open. They all turned round. Cale's here. He noticed that Sylvia was upset about something and decided to ask if she was all right. But we remember she thought it was all her fault. Without a word to Cale, Sylvia ran out the door. Cale caught up to her and grabbed her tightly. She immediately started apologizing to him and saying that she didn't mean to cause him so much trouble. He didn't want to hear anything. In fact, he didn't need to. Instead of some kind of explanation, Cale took it and pulled her tightly against him. Sylvia just couldn't help herself. She snuggled into his shoulder and began to sob convulsively. Cale remained silent. He just stroked her head affectionately, soothing her. Night came and they went to rest. Sylvia fell fast asleep on Cale's chest as the day had been hard enough. Cale became aware of what had happened between Sylvia and Henry. He lay there and thought about the situation. He thought he understood her and what she was going through. But in her past life, she had friends, a home, a family. And the one thing he couldn't understand was that if Henry was her ex-husband, why wasn't he by her side? Why wasn't he protecting her when she needed it so badly? He gently stroked her face, savoring the pleasurable experience of touching her. He thought it didn't matter who she'd been with in the past. She was with him now, and that was the most important thing. Cale was never going to leave her. In the morning, Cale and Sylvia had to leave. They put the few belongings they had in the cart. At parting, Sylvia gave Fiona a big hug. The latter said that she would miss her very much and hoped that Sylvia would be all right. Sylvia hurriedly wiped away the tears in Fiona's eyes. She too said she would miss her, and that this time everything would be all right. Gregory also came to say goodbye to them and gave them a big hug. Cale helped Sylvia into the wagon. Henry also came to say goodbye. He peered warily round the corner and wished me a safe journey. Clearly no one was happy to see Henry. Cale even grabbed his knife, wondering what Henry was up to. Sylvia didn't feel like talking to Henry, but for propriety's sake, she wished him to take care of his new family. They set off on their journey. It is worth noting that Henry was not in a happy mood after all that had happened. He was glum and angry. To thank him for what he had done, Sylvia took Cale's hand and spoke in his language. "I love you." Those words were like a balm to Cale's soul. He hugged Sylvia. Thus embraced, they continued their journey. They traveled to where Finney was waiting for them. They had been given a lot of food and things to carry. It was hard for Cale to carry it all. To somehow motivate him to move faster, Sylvia offered him a race. Whoever was the last to reach Finna would cook a meal. Cale didn't want to lose. He gathered all the strength he had into a fist and began to catch up with Sylvia. He looked a little mad. Sylvia even felt a little scared. But she wasn't going to lose either. The entrance to the cave was already so close. But Cale wanted to be the winner too because he didn't want to cook dinner. So when he caught up with Sylvia, he just tripped her. They both ended up getting stretched out. As they rose, Sylvia noticed that Cale was staring ahead in horror, and there was something to be horrified about. In front of the cave entrance lay Finna, but it looked like she was badly hurt. Cale looked around but didn't see anything suspicious. He immediately ran to the dragon. He leaned over Finna and began stroking her. Cale didn't understand who could have done such an atrocity. Luckily, Finna turned out to be alive. Cale began to scrutinize the injuries on Finna's body and came to the conclusion that another dragon had left them. He thought back to his so-called friends. They must have done it. Cale stood there wondering what to do. They had lost too much time while they were in Sylvia's homeland, and if they lingered in this place, they would be the next victims. But only Finna couldn't walk, and if they left her here, she'd surely die. Cale thought it was all his fault. He couldn't let Finna suffer, so he prepared to pull out a knife to end her suffering. He remembered how small she'd been once. Cale raised the knife high and was about to plunge it into Finna's body. He'd even mentally said goodbye to her. But Sylvia covered Finna with herself. She, too, had grown attached to that dragon. Cale motioned for her to step back, but Sylvia wasn't going to let him do that. She hugged Finna and considered that surely there must be another way in which the dragon could be saved. Cale didn't see it that way, however, and kept insisting that she get out of his way. Sylvia had a dead grip on Finna and didn't want to let go. Finna felt really bad, but she understood what was going to be done to her. Finna whimpered. and real tears dripped from her eyes. What Kale couldn't stand was tears. He dropped his sword and walked away. And Sylvia continued to pet Finna. She was sure she would find a way to save her. Kale stepped back. He thought they didn't have time for all this. Procrastination could get them killed. Kale's mind drifted back to when he was a young boy. He was going to visit the royal family's dragon lair. He was very nervous about it. Then the king took him and his brother to this amazing place to find companions for the day. Inside, the building was incredibly large. Here and there in golden cages sat dragons. There were so many of them. The brother pointed to one large and seemingly strong dragon. Kale looked at this large animal and he became incredibly scared. The king told his brother, Kal, that the choice should be made by Kal himself. The king asked the species that caught his eye were really the strongest or not. The ranger said that even stronger species could be found in the depths. Kale saw a small dragon placed in a cage. The animal was curled up and wary of the man who approached it. That day, Kale made his choice. Kal watched and thought, how could anyone choose such a baby? But it was Kal's choice. The lair keeper held out a small dragonkin to Kale. The little boy looked at him apprehensively. He had never dealt with humans before, and could not understand what to expect from this boy. Kale decided to reassure him by telling him that he was his friend now. He realized he had nothing to fear and licked Kale's face in gratitude. And now he had just recently wanted to kill someone who had once trusted him. Yes, he wanted to ask Finna in pain, but still. Kale decided to go back and see what was going on in the clearing. He saw Sylvia tending to Finna's wounds and giving her the necessary dressings. Sylvia hugged Finna and whispered that she wouldn't leave her. When she saw Kale return, she said she could save Finna. All he had to do was trust her. Kale was in agreement. What was he supposed to do? It was night. Sylvia was so tired from the day that she fell asleep next to Finna. Kale built a fire and sat beside it, pondering his own thoughts. He pulled out his dagger and saw the reflections of his enemies on the blade. Kale had vowed that they would be repaid for what they had done. Morning came. Sylvia woke up and saw that Finna was much better. She was purring again, just like she used to. Sylvia noticed the baskets of food beside them. Kale must have taken care of the food while she slept. Finna was actually feeling better. She had the strength to eat enough. Sylvia noticed Kale nearby, who was sitting on a rock. She walked over to him and touched his cheek. Kale felt good at that touch. He thanked her for keeping Finn from being killed yesterday. Thanks to her, she was okay again. They hugged each other and heard a growl. Finna was making it, and for a reason. She smelled the enemy. She slowly but surely emerged from the cave in order to protect her master. They heard the voice of the enemy. He called for Kale to come out. Kale stepped out. He wasn't going to hide from anyone. He saw the one who was responsible for everything that had happened. The enemy was sitting on a mighty dragon. He jumped down and bared his sword, offering Kale a surrender. The two enemies stood opposite each other. Kale shouted, "What was he doing here, the traitor?" He said with a cheeky grin that he'd come for Kale's breathless body. He just wanted proof of his death. Only then will he be able to receive compensation. Kale stood there thinking that the traitor was hiding in order to kill him. But why? The man had once been his friend. At least that's what Kale had always thought. He, on the other hand, had never seen Kale as a friend. He just needed to gain his trust, and pretending to be a friend was the easiest way to do it. Kale didn't understand why Toko was doing all this. The answer to that question was quite simple and unpleasant. Toko was not serving the king but another lord, and Kale was in his way. Kale was very interested in who Toko called lord, who he served. But what he heard came as a real shock. Toko said that Kal, Kale's brother, was the one who had hired them. He was the one who had drawn up the plan that had trapped Kale. Kale didn't want to believe it. He screamed that it was all a trivial lie. However, Toko said that Kal wanted to clear his father's name and rid the clan of the stupid young prince. Kale was transported back in his memories to his childhood, when he and Kal used to sword fight, play, fool around. He remembered how he had given him the ring. Had Kal been pretending all this time? Toko stated that he didn't have much time, so Kale should just accept his fate with dignity. And afterwards, Toko will deal with the dragon of Kale and the inhabitants of this land. But Kale wasn't going to just stand there and wait to be killed. He drew his sword and prepared to fight. There's a contraction. At some point, Toko had managed to knock the dagger out of Kale's hands. Now he was ready to deliver his deadly blow. But before he did, he decided to torture him a bit and simply wounded him, noting that Kale had never been strong in battles. It was as if he was just taunting him, suggesting he give up. However, Kale was not the kind of person who was willing to lay down his arms and surrender without a single attempt, calling Toko a common coward. The latter hated it when anyone, especially weaklings like Kale, called him a coward. He clutched his mises tighter, ready to attack. Toko inflicted another wound on Kale. He could already taste victory, but Kale managed to dodge and deliver a fatal blow to Kito's chest. The most surprising thing was that even then Kale felt guilty, for Kito was still an old friend to him. Kito, on his last breath, raised his sword again and plunged it into Kale's leg. He screamed in pain. Kito realized he was dying, but he too was a fighter and would not give up until the last. He turned to his dragon, Barak, and ordered it to rain fire. Fire began to burst from Baraku's mouth. All the while Kale was fighting, Sylvia and Finna were in the cave. When they looked outside, they saw that everything around them was on fire. Sylvia ran towards the exit. She was very worried about Kale. She saw that he was seriously injured. He had to pull out the sword that Keto had used to pin Kale to the ground, but Kale could do nothing himself. He needed Sylvia's help. They grabbed the sword together and tried to pull it out, but it didn't work. Sylvia decided to try to tackle the task herself, but no matter how hard she pulled, the sword wouldn't even budge. Her strength was clearly not enough to get the job done. Kale realized that he had to save Sylvia, even at the cost of his own life. He pulled her tight against him and kissed her as tenderly as he could. Then he turned to Finna. He ordered Sylvia to be picked up and carried to safety. Sylvia was against it. She couldn't leave the one who had saved her and whom she had really loved. But Finna always obeyed orders. She picked Sylvia up and held her like a kitten. Kale ordered Finna to run, and she obeyed him as always. Sylvia kept reaching her hands out to Kale, but she was just helpless in this situation, and he just stared after them. The most important thing for him was to know that she was safe. He was not afraid to die with that in mind, though he didn't want to, of course. Finna carried Sylvia further and further away, doing her master's bidding. Sylvia cried all the time. Everything around her was on fire. She was so afraid of losing the Kale she'd just found. Their life together had just begun, and she had grown to love him. And she didn't understand why he did it, why he didn't take care of himself. She couldn't afford to lose him. Sylvia looked up and saw 3 dragons in the sky. She realized that their masters were nearby, coming for Kale. In the meantime, Kale had visitors. Whether they were friends or foes was hard to say. Their faces were covered by dark hoods. They grabbed him, causing him great pain. Kale realized he was miraculously alive, and the first thing he did was start asking about Sylvia. Unknown people carried him to some room and put tourniquets on his injured limbs. He was lying on a table, a fire burning merrily nearby. He wondered who these people were and what they wanted from him. One of them took off his hood. It was the merchant to whom he had sold his locket for silver coins. Kale was extremely surprised, but he still didn't understand where he was or what this man wanted from him. His anxiety for Sylvia never left him. The merchant hastened to reassure him that all was well, and Kale should get a good night's rest. He brought up a bandage soaked in some sort of remedy and placed it over Kale's face. The merchant's green eyes looked at Kale in a friendly way. There was no sign of anger or contempt in them. Turns out Sylvia was in the house too. When she woke up, she started looking around. She didn't realize where she was, but she was more concerned about Kale and Finna than her own. She even thought they were dead, and it didn't bring her any joy to wake up. After all, she didn't even get to say goodbye to them. Sylvia heard the door creak open. She thought someone was trying to get into her room, but there was no one in sight. She decided to go to the door and see what was behind it. Maybe there's an intruder lurking there. But beyond the door was another room, in which an incredible surprise awaited her. She saw Kale alive and sleeping peacefully. She rushed to him. She was overjoyed, for she had said goodbye to him in her mind, thinking she would never see him again. When Kale woke up, he even thought he was just dreaming about Sylvia. But no, she was here in front of him, alive and unharmed. One question troubled them both: where they were. But neither Sylvia nor Kale knew the answer. What was going on here, they didn't know. Meanwhile, Kal was in his castle. He was waiting to meet his guest. When she arrived, immediately greeted her. She had heard that he wanted revenge on the inhabitants of Earth.